Hello and welcome to Coronanomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we look at the biggest events of yet another historic week with you, our live audience. So please join the conversation on Twitter or using the hashtag Coronanomics or on YouTube in the comments section. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
And I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent. Well, yes, it's been another busy 7 days of coronavirus-related news. The president of Brazil tested positive for coronavirus, despite previously telling us that Brazilians never catch anything. There he is there, kindly taking his mask off for the assembled press there. Not sure that's the required protocol. We've learned also, thanks to the UK Chancellor's exceptionally hard-working communications team, that there are expensive cyber mugs that can keep your beverage heated to a constant temperature for up to 3 hours. But could they be vulnerable to malevolent Chinese hackers who might wish to scorch the tongues of UK ministers? Better not tell those Tory backbenchers. Also, this week, a Twitter-loving reality TV narcissist revealed he's running for president of the United States of America. Kanye West also revealed his interest in the job.
Joining us to talk about all that and more is Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, who was previously an economics correspondent at the Financial Times. We also have Danny Dorling, a Professor of Geography at Oxford University, who's written many books, including Slow Down, in which he suggested that economies were set to slow down long before the pandemic happened. So we'll be looking forward to lots more of these predictions tonight. Gemma, Danny, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, in the next half hour, we're all going to be picking our moments of the week, but we're also, as is traditional, letting you, our audience, pick yours as well. And we've given you a choice this week of moments related to the Chancellor's summer statement. And we want to know what is most likely to get you out spending. Would it be, number one, a VAT cut for attractions, things like theme park admissions? Is it number two, up to £5,000 for energy-saving home improvements, lagging your loft, etc.? Or what about number three, no stamp duty on some house purchases until next March? So get voting, go to @Coronanomics and make your choice, and we will discuss it at the end of the programme. If you also, don't forget, if you want to ask us a question live, ask us on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using that hashtag Coronanomics. So let's move on to our guests' moments of the week. And we're going to start with you, Danny. What was your moment of the week?
My moment of the week was when I spluttered into my tea as I heard the Chancellor make an announcement. And it was because this is the former head boy of Winchester College, which is a rather expensive school to go to. It is the son-in-law of a billionaire. And he was announcing, I think it was half-price deals on the equivalent of Happy Meals, if you like, just in August, if you eat out on Monday, Tuesday, or a Wednesday. And it was that just a position between the enormous wealth of him and his family and this £10 off. And I thought, they're flying blind. They have no idea if this will help or not, but somebody suggested it, and they're desperate for ideas, and they came up with that one.
I mean, Danny, some people have said that even though, it's a drop in the ocean, it's actually quite a clever use of nudge theory, nudging people in the direction of eating out again. And we had Cass Sunstein on the show a few weeks ago, the man behind the nudge. Behavioural economics has been a theme of the government's response to the crisis. Isn't there something clever about it?
But with behavioural economics, you test it first before you do something. So for people donating organs, you see what happens if you make it opt-in rather than opt-out, and the same for pensions, and you check what happens. It's not going to be the thing that will save these businesses from crashing or not crashing. I'm sure that nobody produced a model in the Treasury and said, we think that 2% of slightly dodgy small restaurants will make it through on the basis of the extra dozen customers they're going to get on Tuesday in the second week of August. There's no model behind this. It's a gimmicky thing. And I think it's to distract attention away from the more serious things that could have been suggested. They could have said, we are really going to level, not level up, because you can't all become as rich as Westminster or Kensington and Chelsea. That's a silly phrase, levelling up, in a country which has such rich areas. We're going to level out. And I'm afraid that those who are incredibly wealthy are going to have to take a hit because the country has become dramatically poorer. Now, if you don't want to say that, and if you don't want questions asked about that, you throw things like free or half-price Happy Meals onto the table to deflect attention.
Yeah. Gemma, can I ask you? We've been looking back at what happened in the last recession, and then, of course, the government cut VAT. The IFS, which I think you might have been there at the time, but they did some work looking at how effective that had been, and they found that actually it did help stimulate some spending. Are you as pessimistic as Danny about the possibility of A, the meal deal, and B, the VAT cut actually helping stimulate consumption?
So VAT cut is a pretty sort of traditional economic tool to try and stimulate consumption. You're right that the evidence from the post-financial crisis period was that the temporary VAT cut that happened at that time did do quite a lot to stimulate investment spending at that time. I guess the reason to be a bit more cautious about what they did this week was that it's just a VAT cut for eating out, going to attractions. So one of the big things that happened post-financial crisis was that people brought forward spending on big items. They bought those durables. They did up their houses because it was cheaper for the VAT at that point. You're probably not going to get the same kind of reaction to people going out for meals and going to Thorpe Park and that sort of thing, or other attractions are available. So I think it's we would expect less to happen this time. I'm probably a little bit less sceptical than Danny is about the eat out to help out vouchers. I'm sure he's right that the Treasury didn't have great data. There was no trial of this policy to see what it's going to do. But to be fair to them, you can kind of think of they want to try and do something for the restaurant sector. The difficulty is that restaurants are still being told you can't have as many customers in your restaurant as you used to. So you want to both encourage people to go to restaurants, but you want to encourage them to go to restaurants at the times of the week when restaurants are likely to have spare spaces available. Probably that's on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights. So I can see where they were going with it. Whether they have any evidence that it's going to work, I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Well, it'll be an interesting case. Well, we'll be able to see from the results, and that will inform future governments as they attempt their stimulus policies. We're going to go to a live question to Liam, who's a student in London. Hello, Liam. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
Thank you for joining us. Do you want to give the panel your question?
Yeah, so my question is, I'm due to go back to university, but had to have employment to finance my course and accommodation. I'm worried there will be a shortage of work opportunities for all students due to the change in retail and hospitality. The question is, do you think this will change?
Maybe let's stick with you, Gemma. I mean, a lot of young people, students, do work in these particular sectors. It's in their interest that this sector does get help, isn't it?
It is, and this is precisely the reason why the Chancellor has probably focused a lot of help in that sector, is that it is one that creates a lot of jobs, and particularly for young people. The other measures in his announcements on Wednesday were clearly also focused on a particular concern about whether jobs will be available for young people. So the Kickstarter program, giving businesses money if they take on, create new jobs for people aged between 16 and 24. So there was a lot of what was there was focused on exactly the group like Liam, who are young people looking for work, entering the labour market. The government is clearly particularly worried about them not being able to find work at this stage and risking ending up in long-term unemployment. But it's a genuine concern. The economy is still going to be weak in the autumn. Those sorts of sectors are still, unless there's a sudden emergence of a vaccine or better treatments, those sectors are still going to be struggling to operate normally. And I guess, I mean, this is more anecdotally, but my sense from what I see of the organisations I'm involved with is there is a bit of a sense of businesses kind of trying to keep on the workers they have and perhaps cutting back on hiring new workers, and I guess that's a real concern.
Yeah. And Danny, what would you, if you were designing policy to help people like Liam, what would you be proposing and implementing?
Well, for university students who are having to work to pay their fees, I would be bold. I would do what the SNP would do, or Labour, or Plaid Cymru, or the Liberals. So every party apart from the one in government, and I'd get rid of the fees. But of course, somebody has to pay for universities, and if you get rid of the fees, you've got to find another source of money. Now, we currently fund universities on a never-never. You know, the idea that actually these loans are going to be repaid, and we know they're not. So it's a short-term kind of Ponzi scheme. I would bite the bullet with the virus, and I would actually say, you know, this has come to a point where we can be like the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe doesn't have fees. Scotland doesn't have fees. What on earth are we doing making people pay fees for courses when they can't earn the money to make them? And it's unnecessary. And that's what I would do, particularly as we're about to lose our European students. If you want to come from the mainland of Europe to a British university, you've got to get a visa next year. You've also got to pay, I think it's £420, or might be 470 every year you're here for your anticipated use of the NHS. Oh, and pay overseas fees. So that's what I do. But of course, what the government could do is go, well, young people haven't got anything else to do. We know they've got to go to university because there won't be any jobs. So let's just keep on making them pay these enormous fees that they'll never be able to pay back because their salaries are never going to be that high.
Danny, it's you're at one of the world's most prestigious universities, if not the most. Are you worried about the future of university finances after this? You mentioned about international students.
Yeah. Even in Oxford, we're worried about finances. Not far from us, there are universities that are petrified, and I won't. I've seen estimates of 10, 20, 30 higher million pounds. So the sector is absolutely terrified. But it's partly because we got ourselves into this model where we were so reliant on hopes and dreams. We were reliant on people flying in from China. We were charging people a fortune compared to, say, Germany, where they have more overseas students than we do, but they charge them almost nothing. So they're not reliant on them. So when the overseas students don't come to Germany, it's not a great problem for German universities. So we got ourselves into this difficulty, and we also did it very, very recently. You've got to remember £9,000 a year undergraduate fees. It only came in 2012. We've managed to create a system that's gone defunct in less than 10 years, okay, with the help of a pandemic as well. But no, it is a worry. We have furloughed staff in the colleges in Oxford. We have tens of thousands of summer school students who haven't come. If you wonder how the colleges manage to fund themselves in Oxford, it's actually loads of teenagers who arrive in the summer and the tourists who aren't here. Now, it's very pleasant at the moment in this city because there are no students and there are no tourists and it's beautiful, but it's not going to carry on working like that. And all kinds of things change. For the first time ever in history of the university, we held exams online. And it worked. It was brilliant. And students wrote much better answers when they typed them than when they sat in these exam halls scribbling them, it turns out. And many of us have sworn we're never going to go back to that again. We've got interviews coming up in November. We cannot bring 10,000 young people into a city for interviews. It's irresponsible in November. So we've got to work out how we're going to do that differently. It's a big shake-up for universities. People are very, very frightened. And that's the people working in them. You know, so the people who are thinking of trying to get a job in a university is worse. And what's even worse is in normal times, in the past, you'd go to Canada, you'd go to New Zealand, you'd leave Britain and try to get an academic job somewhere else. But because this thing is worldwide, that isn't a possibility at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant.
Except, well, China. China is the place, if you can get into China, China is massively ramping up its master's courses right now. Because why would you want to go out of China, which is such a safe place, and fly into some of the most dangerous places on earth for the privilege of doing a master's in economics.
Well, thanks, Danny. Liam, I hope you got something out of that. Thank you for joining us, and very best of luck with the job search as well.
Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. Don't forget, if you've got a question, ask in our YouTube comments or on Twitter using the hashtag Coronomics, and vote in our poll on Twitter as well.
Now, Gemma, I wonder, what was your moment of the week?
My moment of the week was when I kind of picked up on the point that was in Rishi Sunak's document, which was that the Treasury has set aside £15 billion for spending on personal protective equipment for the health services. And this is just a genuinely huge amount of money to be spending just on personal protective equipment, even acknowledging that we know this has been a really important sort of piece of equipment for those services. I mean, to put it in context, this is sort of 2/3 of the amount that the government normally spends every year in total on social care. It's more than the business department spends in a year. It's 11% of the entire health and social care department's budget normally in a year. It's a huge amount of money.
It's interesting. A few months ago, earlier in the crisis, I spoke to a small business that had offered to bring PPE in for the government, to try and help the national effort. And it was turned down, but the company then found out that the government had allegedly gone to its Chinese supplier, paid more, and got PPE of a lower specification. So, this week, today, there have been lots of calls for an inquiry into the way that PPE has been procured. Would you support that, Gemma?
I think that has to be done at the end of this. There have been a number of stories like the one you talked about there, and there was another case that the government are being taken to court for giving an over £100 million contract to a pest control firm that had only 16 employees and no history of supplying these sorts of things. So there has to be an assessment at the end of this of how the money was spent, whether proper procedures were followed, even taking account of the fact the government needed to act quickly to get PPE onto the front line. We have to look at how this huge amount of money has been spent.
Now, Danny, can I ask you, I mean, just to put the case for the government, there was obviously a huge global shortage of PPE. There was huge demands on the government to source it. Couldn't we say that perhaps it was reasonable for them to pull every lever possible to not follow the usual procedures, just to get this stuff into the country, no matter how they could get it, no matter how they, do whatever they needed to do to get it in? Isn't that a potential defence of what's happened here?
We're going to hear all kinds of defences. It's a tricky position for this government. David Cameron, if you like, got the most able ministers. When Theresa May took over, she couldn't have his, so she got the next ones. Boris has been left with the C team, and they could only be a minister for him if they signed up to his document not to question Brexit. And then they're suddenly given a really difficult job to do, and they weren't the A or B teams. I live in Oxford. We've had so many Hercules aircraft flying over to Brize Norton, carrying stuff stitched together in Turkey that turns out not to be any good. You can actually hear them. So they've tried. But they should not have privatised NHS procurement. They should have taken some notice of the test that was done, I think, 2 years ago about what would happen, and they didn't. Jeremy Hunt could have done a lot more. Jeremy Hunt is a very capable politician, unlike Matt Hancock. So why didn't Jeremy Hunt do more when he was Health Secretary? But if you step back from this, other countries do better. The most extreme in Europe is Finland, which has been stockpiling PPE since the 1957 flu epidemic. That is the kind of attitude that makes you a safe country. Whereas we have this madness of privatising procurement, which has certainly not saved the NHS money in general. Everything that can be privatised around the edge of the NHS and also often within it, they keep on trying to do it. And it's created a disaster. And the other thing well worth saying is the care homes. The care homes are largely private. These are private companies which didn't see themselves as having any responsibility to prepare for something like this, and tell the government that it's their job to provide this PPE, while the care homes will carry on making a profit, and the landlords and the hedge funds behind the care homes will carry on making a profit and not contribute towards the 15 billion cost.
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? You know, the care homes have almost become treated like the NHS in the sort of popular narrative, despite the fact that, as you say, the ownership is very, very different from hospitals. We've got a question from Tahir Rashid, who's a GP in North East London, and he asks, what's the likelihood that the Treasury will consider giving doctors and nurses a pay rise after what they've been through? Now, let me put that to you, Gemma. It wasn't in the mini budget yesterday. Do you think an NHS pay rise, a pay rise for NHS staff, is likely down the road?
So, I mean, we'd already had the government announce a pay rise for the NHS this year. Even before coronavirus hit, it was clear that the period of trying to cap and not increase public sector pay had come to its end. It had reached a limit, and the government was struggling to kind of keep the staff it needed and attract the new ones it wanted. So I think that era was already over. Quite how coronavirus translates into more pressure for pay increases in the NHS, I think remains to be seen. Rishi Sunak was very careful not to commit to anything along those lines when he was pushed on it this week. I mean, I do wonder whether this ought to be a wider question than just about the headline pay. The conditions in which NHS staff are having to work these days are very different, very much more difficult than what they had before. It's, from what I can understand, a much harder effort, much more stressful job to be working in hospitals in full protective equipment now. So I wonder whether a wider rethink of the conditions and the sort of shift patterns and how all of that works, as well as pay.
Yes, exactly. You know, we heard a lot about clapping for carers, but as the carers themselves have pointed out, it's not claps we want, it's better pay and conditions, as you mentioned, Gemma. Don't forget, if you've got a question, ask in the YouTube comments and also on Twitter with the hashtag Coronanomics, and vote in our poll. Right, we're going to go to your moment of the week now, Lizzie. Take it away.
Well, the stock market darling Boohoo, its shares crashed after allegations of sweatshop labour in Leicester, which was linked to the lockdown there after a spike in coronavirus cases. But today they've bounced back after a pledge to improve factory conditions there. This is a story close to my heart because when I was a teenager in Manchester, I used to earn a bit of pocket money working for Boohoo before and after, the other way. But it never crossed my mind, I must say, that this may have been the reason that the clothes were cheap. I always thought that it was because they didn't have actual shops, it was all online. But it's got me thinking about fast fashion. One of the ironies here is how much Boohoo's been promoting the Black Lives Matter campaign. Although in the first round of investigations, there was no evidence found of wrongdoing. But Gemma, I want to ask you, this issue has been brought to the government's attention time and time again over the years. And I wonder, is it time now for a major response to the issue of fast fashion?
I think it is. I'm glad this story has hit the headlines again. I'm glad that ministers are taking notice. But you're right, this is not the first time that the government has been made aware of these issues. My former colleague Sarah O'Connor wrote a really good in-depth research article on this back in 2018, gave evidence to a House of Commons Select Committee. Ministers have known about this, local authorities have known about this. It's been an open secret, as Sarah says, and nothing has been done about it. And that means that there are huge numbers of people not being paid properly, working in poor conditions in Leicester, and contributing to really just, I mean, obviously the spread of coronavirus, but just appalling working conditions being maintained. So yes, I think it is time that the government actually does something about it and takes some responsibility for it.
Danny, the world of retail and fashion has kind of been put on pause through this crisis. Is it time when they restart to reset and change fashion's ways finally?
I think it's going to be difficult for things to go back to normal. The previous pandemics, the fast up and down ones are the 1968, 57, 51 and 1918. Economically, they all had a V-shaped pattern. 2 years after, it was as if the pandemic hadn't happened. But of course, none of them did we behave in this way. Did we actually stop everything? We've been wearing the same clothes that we bought in November and December and January, and the world hasn't ended. You know, we might finally become a slightly green and begin to wear some of our clothes out. We discovered, you know, it's nice to have a haircut, but do you really need to have one every 3 weeks that cost a fortune? And this is very tricky for the economy, because we have an economy based on really, really high employment numbers. Having people, students working, for instance, having people doing 2 or 3 jobs, kind of an American style economy is what we're moving towards. And that requires unnecessary consumption, large amounts of unnecessary consumption. If people decide after this to rein things back a little bit, to be more careful, and partly because they'll have family and friends who are unemployed and they might want to help them out rather than, you know, buy another shirt, we're going to have to begin to adjust for that. And, you know, I'm a geographer, I'm not an economist, I'm not what the geographers do. We worry about climate change. That's the main thing. That's the main thing we do. And it's absolutely on the cards. And yeah, there comes a point that there will have to come a point, and this pandemic could possibly have a silver lining to it if it creates the turn earlier than the turn would have occurred otherwise.
It's interesting how that intersects with the question we had earlier about jobs, say, in retail. But we've also got a question now on the subject of another spike in the virus from Holly in Dunfermline. Are you there, Holly?
Hi there.
Great. What's your question?
What happens if we are hit with a second wave of the pandemic? The furlough scheme will have ended, and with the economy already struggling, is there a contingency plan?
Great. Gemma, would you like to go for that one?
Sure. I think it's a great question, because as it stands, the Chancellor has said the furlough scheme is coming to the end at the end of October. It will not be continued. But I think there's a real possibility that the Treasury will revise its plans if it needs to. What we've seen so far since the end of March is that the Treasury has announced policies, looked at the evidence, iterated on it to see what's needed. And I think if we ended up in a situation of a further economy-wide shutdown, then the Treasury would, and the Chancellor would rethink, do we need to come back with something like the wage subsidy scheme again? I think what the sort of stance of policy they've got at the moment is based on the assumption that we are now reopening, we're into the recovery phase. I think if we had another widespread shutdown, they may reassess their policy choices.
Danny, there was talk about if the Rishi Sunak said himself, if he'd extended the furlough scheme for another month, people would have called for another month and another month. So was it not responsible to move into the recovery stage, as Gemma says?
I think it was responsible to end the furlough. It's a scheme going nowhere, but you just should have replaced it with something a bit more imaginative. On second waves, I'll stick my neck out slightly, but this is the first pandemic when we've worried about second waves. The 1968 flu, which killed as many people, given that the whole population was lower, had a second wave in 1970 and a third in 1972 because people weren't looking out for them. And the 1918 flu famously had a second wave, which was larger. The chances of a second wave, at least anywhere in Europe, are so low given the enormous surveillance that there is. Even with the most incompetent government, which is ours, and in terms of Europe, and also a tricky situation. England is really hard to deal with a pandemic because we scatter people across it, whereas other European countries are easier. But a second wave would require immense incompetence for it to happen. I just don't think it will happen. But of course, the danger is you say that, and people stop worrying, and that's when you get a second wave. But there's no sign of a second wave anywhere in Europe. The level of paranoia is so high, and track and trace is not that difficult, even though we've managed to make a bunch of it so far. You know, and in fact, our scientists in London have helped Germany create the track and trace system which works, which we're just going to have to adopt. It's only silly jingoism, which means we don't already say yes, of course, we'll use that one, but eventually.
Holly, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for coming on the show. Now, don't forget at home, there's still time to vote for your moment of the week on our poll on Twitter. And if you've got a question, ask away using the hashtag Coronanomics on Twitter or on YouTube in the comments section. Ben, it's your turn. What's your moment of the week?
Well, I mentioned it in the intro, Lizzie, and it is Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil himself, getting coronavirus. And I think this is an important moment because it's emblematic, really, of how serious the situation is in Brazil at the moment. They've had 66,000 coronavirus deaths already there. It's more than the UK. And it's been particularly hard hit is Brazil's indigenous population. It's far from under control. On the same day that Bolsonaro was diagnosed with it, Brazil reported another 45,000 new cases. It seems to be growing faster there than any other country at the moment. Now, I think reasonable people can disagree on how appropriate full lockdowns were for poorer countries, places where not working can potentially mean starving. But leadership is a completely different matter. Bolsonaro has been pushing quack cures for this disease. He's been downplaying the seriousness of it. He's been overriding health advice. He's fired 2 health ministers, and the present health minister is a general. It's just really beyond words what's going on there. Now, Bolsonaro is sometimes described as Trump of the tropics. Frankly, he makes Trump look a bit like Abraham Lincoln at times. So I think this is a big moment for all those reasons. But I'd like to ask you, Danny, we do tend to focus on Donald Trump's gross mishandling of the crisis in the United States, but not so much on Bolsonaro's, even though Brazil, as I was saying, is a massive global hotspot for the disease. What is that? Is it a blind spot? Is it Anglophilia? What would you put that down to?
I would put it down to a kind of prejudice where, for countries that are a little bit poorer than us, we don't treat people the same. When there is a disaster, it requires several hundred more deaths for it to be announced. You can see that kind of prejudice in the news. So I think that's partly it. And of course, we are obsessed by America. That's another side. Yeah. But it's worth saying there is a pattern here. And okay, I would say this, but the UK, the most economically unequal country of what was the EU 28, has the worst record, at least of management. Outside, Russia does very badly. That's a very unequal country. Brazil, as you know, is a very unequal country. The United States is in the top kind of 4 or 5 of the OECD in terms of inequality. And there does seem to be a connection between mismanaging the economy and thinking that high rates of inequality are fine and mismanaging the pandemic. It's not as simple as that. Chance matters. If a business person from China had arrived in Edinburgh on New Year's Eve with the disease, we'd be talking about the Scottish pandemic of Europe. Okay, so chance matters greatly in a pandemic. But the longer this goes on, for those countries where there aren't other reasons, like very different age distributions, meaning that they have higher or lower deaths, I think we do have to begin to say there's an obvious pattern between these narcissistic men who run governments in favour of inequality and places like New Zealand or Finland or Germany, which have done much better. And the sample size of nation states is not too small that you will be able to call a reckoning in a year or 2 years on this and how people reacted to it.
Gemma, in the UK context, a lot of people have been saying that the UK government's handling of it has exposed fundamental weaknesses in the UK state, whether it's political leadership or the civil service. What's your view at the Institute of Government on that big question?
I think there's been quite a mixed picture. I think the Treasury has rightly received praise for the sort of economic response. It's been quite creative. It seems to have managed to get policies, quite novel policies, the wage subsidy scheme up and running pretty quickly, and to have focused very much on what was possible as well as what was economically desirable. On the other hand, there have clearly been huge problem areas. The the health response has not been quite what you would have liked it to have been. There have been problems of coordinating the testing. Public Health England has come in for criticism, and the sort of disconnect between what ministers have been saying is happening and then what's actually happening in practice. All of that clearly needs to be looked at. I mean, there are clearly two schools of thought. Ministers will say we don't have enough direct control. People further down the chain need to listen to us. On the other hand, probably people further down the chain would say, we know what's going on the ground, trust us, rather than trying to direct everything from number 10.
Right, we've come close to the end, so we're going to reveal what you have chosen, you at home, in our poll, our Twitter poll. A reminder of what we gave you as your choices for Moment of the Week. They were VAT cuts for theme park tickets, subsidy for green home improvements, lugging your loft, etc., and the no stamp duty on house purchase until March. What was the moment of the week for you? What was most likely to get you out spending? And we can reveal the winners. Let's have a look. Look at that. Who would have thought it? Subsidy on loft lagging has beaten VAT cuts for going to the theme park and a cut in your stamp duty to zero. Well, so Danny, you've written a book about housing, one of your many, many books that you've written. What's your view on loft lagging? But no, let's ask you about the stamp. Let's ask you about stamp duty. Actually, you didn't win.
The stamp duty.
Probably have something to say about
stamp duty. Much, yeah. I do on the stamp duty. I think it's a terrible policy. You were talking earlier about wage increases for doctors and nurses. One of the best ways to improve the financial position of doctors and nurses, particularly in the south of England, is not to inflate house prices. House prices have been falling. ONS have not released their house price data since March. You can click it; it says delayed, because they don't want to show what's been happening to them. The Nationwide withdrew its mortgage of over 85%. You cannot get a mortgage of over 85% now. The banks and building societies know what's happening. And house prices falling was potentially one of the good things from this, because they were far too high. I live very near to John Radcliffe Hospital. Doctors are sharing 2 doctors to a very small flat. I don't know how on earth the nurses managed to live anywhere near that hospital. Stamp duty is about protecting the house prices of older conservative voters. Why on earth would you have done this other than a real fear that the bottom will drop out of the housing market? Now, Gemma might say, maybe I'm a bit flippant and, it really could have been free fall and this might stop a free fall. But the fastest way to increase the living conditions of the vast majority of people in Britain is to reduce the cost of their rent or buying a house. And I wish we would aim towards doing that, rather than to see a 3-bed terrace at £500,000 is something to sort of an achievement, because it isn't.
Now, Gemma, on the loft lagging question, it's interesting, isn't it? Because pretty much everyone agrees this needs to be done, right? We need to sort of sort out the insulation of our homes if we're going to have any chance of meeting the 2050 net zero targets. Why not just pay for it all? Because, of course, this is a subsidy. It's not covering the full cost. What would be the argument against just the government doing it for free for everyone?
So the announcement this week was for lower income households. They actually are doing it for free. They're offering £10,000 to cover the full cost. So it's the sort of middle and higher income households who are being expected to meet some of the cost. I mean, presumably part of the reason for that is they want people to have some incentive to do some due diligence on the people who are coming around, giving them a quote for doing this loft lagging, not just give them a free voucher and find that it's totally rubbish, or you're being charged way over the odds. So I think that's why they're making you put some of your skin in the game.
And are you going to get your loft lagged?
I might do. It does need lagging. Well, actually, I'm in the middle of a house purchase, so I'm the definition of dead weight on that policy.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we looked at solar panels for our house last year and were really put off by the cost. So I'm hoping that might potentially be one of the things that you might be able to do with this subsidy. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end. Thank you so much to our guests, Danny and Gemma, for joining us And for you at home for watching and for sending in your questions, do keep them coming in for future weeks. Apologies if we didn't get to yours this week. We will hope to do so in future episodes.
And don't forget to check out our latest episode on globalization with Danny Roderick and Penny Goldberg, which is available on our YouTube channel now. You can also follow us on Twitter at Coronanomics TV for all our latest updates.
Now, as usual, our outro is going to be played by a former guest on Coronanomics, Lord Stuart Wood. What a guy. He kindly sent us in a recorded outro. But we noticed that Danny has got a guitar in the back of his slot as well. So maybe in future weeks, when he's learned this really difficult tune, he can give it a go as well. But in the meantime, thanks again for joining us, and take it away, Lord Wood.